Welcome to the council meeting, work session. We've got 4, so we're going to start. And our first item is a resolution for the Housing Trust Fund loan request to Liberty Uptown Associates for the development at 325 East and 2nd South. And I think we have Nick Tarbett, Melissa Jensen, and Lily Gray at the table. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us. We'll go ahead and kick it off. I thought it might be beneficial just to take a 1-minute recap of the Housing Trust Fund Board and how the process came here, how we got here to today. The Housing Trust Fund Board has traditionally been Salt Lake City's main funding source for affordable housing throughout the city. There were many years that this mechanism was not used very thoroughly or properly. Some years we did 0 loans, some years we did 1. And over the last few years, as you can imagine, especially with Mike Ackerlow's leadership, we garnered a lot more interest and we understood developers' needs. And really, they began to engage with us, and that's been very productive, and we've truly appreciated the council's support over this time. We've traditionally functioned as a gap financing mechanism. That means when loans generally arrive at the Housing Trust Fund Board, they have the majority of their financing in place. So for a deal that's 30 or 50 million, all of that financing is in place, and then they usually ask the Housing Trust Fund for a gap financing piece. To that end, most of the deals, and I would say 90% of them, are tax credit deals. And that means they get most of their equity, most of their cash in the deal from a tax credit source, either 4% or 9%. And I won't go into the details of either of those. But just to provide some context, Housing and Neighborhood Development underwrites each transaction, make sure it complies with ordinance. And then with the developer, they present that transaction to the board. And then it goes through an administrative approval, and then here for you for final approval. And we make it very clear to our community that this is the place for that final approval. So I just wanted to provide that as a basis, and then I'll let Lily kick us off on the actual transaction. Thank you for letting me do that.
So yeah, I will just provide a short summary of the loan that's before you today, and we are available for any questions. This project is called Liberty Uptown. It is part of the larger Violin Commons development, which consists of several properties which create a true spectrum of housing affordability from permanent supportive housing to market rate. Liberty Uptown is a project that applied for a Housing Trust Fund loan. It is a 109-unit mixed income building. 46 of those units would be affordable, and that is for a range of affordability, which also includes some deeply targeted units. 63 of the units would be market rate, so it's a mixed income building. The developer requested a Housing Trust Fund loan to serve as gap financing. This project received 4% tax credit allocation, private activity bonds, and also has state Olene Walker financing. The Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board reviewed this proposal in September and recommended approval of a $1 million loan to the project, which is before you guys today for approval. The property has a mix of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units. It will also have ground floor active retail use. The other piece of information wanted to share just on terms of schedule, the goal is for construction to start later this year with completion sometime in 2020. So please let us know if you have any questions on this loan.
Just have one question.
Councilmember Rogers.
Let's see. My question is in regards to the LIHTC financing, the 4% or 9% tax credits. Have they already applied once before for the tax credits?
Yes, a point of clarification. For this deal in particular, it is a 4% tax credit, and they went to the Private Activity Board, and they only applied once for those. They had to apply twice for the Magnolia, which is the permanent supportive housing piece. So the first year, they were not successful in gaining the 9% tax credits, which is also why sort of, because it's an entire project kind of all connected together, there was almost a year delay in sort of moving it forward. And so we have worked very closely with both Form Development and Cowboy Partners to keep the ball rolling on this.
And it looks good for the new proposals moving forward?
Yes.
I mean, you never know with the tax credits, right?
They did receive the 9% allocation for the Magnolia, which is the 65-unit permanent supportive housing piece, which was really the pivotal piece of financing to move everything forward. So that was very exciting news.
And it was pivotal for the city. We really wanted to make sure that we had the permanent supportive housing. And so I think that the developer was sensitive to making sure that they could deliver on that critical piece before moving forward all of the other pieces. And so thanks to the advocacy of the community, we were able to get the permanent supportive housing allocation from Utah Housing Corporation. And as a result, I think the project was awarded based on its merits.
You good, Rogers? Could you build a little bit more context for us, and perhaps we should invite our applicants up for this piece of it, because I have met with each of you separately and over years now, it feels like, about the different pieces of this project. And it's important to me that we flesh this out in the public realm right now, because to read this as a single project in a high opportunity area, this is really, for this one building, a fairly low amount of affordability at 40%. If you look at it just as this building, we've said time and again that we want to support projects in high areas of high opportunity that have a higher ratio of affordability. So we need to contextualize this piece of the project amongst the Magnolia, and perhaps if you want to talk about any of the other pieces, then it really becomes a high opportunity, high investment in affordability.
Thank you, and we'll have them join, and while they're joining us, I will just say that I particularly want to commend both the developers and my team. They have done a lot of negotiation over the last year, and so I know that Chris will shed some light on that as he goes forward.
Chris, pull that mic up and just introduce yourself for us.
Very good. My name is Chris Zarek. I am from Form Development. Form and Cowboy Partners are partnering on the project wide, including Liberty Uptown, which is the subject of this particular hearing.
Great.
So the project overall is called Violent School Common, and that name is a nod to the Violent School across the street. It's when you're trying to contextualize the site to people and have them understand where we're at. If they don't know the public safety building, they do know the Violent School. So we're borrowing a little bit of the soul of that particular icon within the neighborhood. And it's also the name that we've given to the open space that is really the anchor for this particular project. Liberty Uptown is the large building to the east, and we've designed it in such a way that it is wrapping a parking garage that is shared amongst both Liberty Uptown, the Metropolitan, the site retail, and so forth. So the Metropolitan is our new name for the old public safety building, the Northwest Pipeline building. We are doing a full historic rehab to that building. It's one of only 2 international style buildings in Salt Lake City, and it's on the National Register, so it's important to us and important to HAND, and part of the vision for this project that building be rehabilitated. So we're excited to get our hands dirty with that one. And then, of course, the Magnolia, which is to the northwest, 65 permanent supportive housing units. We have been working with Shelter the Homeless and the Road Home as the owner and operator of that particular building. It's also envisioned to have a social enterprise space, which will have some community neighborhood retail aspect to it, and that's something that we're going to be working both with HAND and other individuals from the city with the Road Home to find out what the right concept is. The Metropolitan and Liberty Uptown have, as was stated, neighborhood retail and commercial space that will both energize the street and activate the common. And to your point, Councilmember Mendenhall, we've really been looking at the project as a whole. You know, the buildings are individual to themselves, and they're designed individually as well, but they're also we've envisioned them and we'll be designing them, and the site is being designed as a whole. And so in our original response to this RFP, our point was to take what is now an empty building and an empty lot and repair the neighborhood fabric. And we think that all of the aspects here, the market rate units, the workforce housing, the permanent supportive housing, are really reflective of both the city and that particular neighborhood. The uses that we're putting in there, the open space, the retail, the residential, all of those things are very at home in the Central City neighborhood and very much a part of that place and a part of that neighborhood. And so we think as a whole, it's certainly, we hope to be speaking to affordability, and we hope to be speaking to increased residential in the downtown area. But, we've also, we've envisioned so much more here, and we're excited to get started.
I think just one point to add there is that of the total housing units that are on the site, 111 of those are affordable, restricted, and 137 are market. So that was the overall mix if you look at all the components.
And is it 67 at the Magnolia, 64?
65.
65, all permanent supportive. Yeah, the depth of affordability with that chunk of this project it balances the scale a little differently than just those numbers of 111 versus so it's just under 50% if you look at the total number of units, but the depth of affordability. I
think that's an important point. We really felt that, and we've been fortunate to work with HAND. Getting to that level of affordability is a difficult task, and it's taken a lot of work.
So we see you coming back to us for a loan request on the Magnolia?
No. No, the Magnolia has been awarded 9% tax credits, and those are projected to cover the costs and development of that particular building. So I can't say that it's envisioned right now.
It's interesting. We had a lot of worries, actually, as you can imagine, with the not this administration, but the U.S. administration at the end of the year with the threat of tax credits going away. And we were scrambling very thoroughly to determine what the impact would be on this project in particular, because it is wholly reliant on tax credits. And so we feel very fortunate to be at this place today, moving forward with a plan. I think it's important to also note that while they got 4% tax credits, which generally support 60% area median income, they've also chosen to maintain more about 40 or 50 area median income are on those units as well, even though they could go up to 60% AMI. So again, it is they're targeting lower incomes than we traditionally see in these tax credit projects. And 4% in general, I would say, are hard to finance.
Council members, do you have any questions?
I have one question, Madam Chair.
Please.
Last week, we spoke about inclusionary zoning, right? And does anyone remember the total number of inclusionary zoning affordable units that have been built in the 40 years that he had spoken about? I want to say it was 15,000. Is that about right? So we're looking at about 300 affordable units a year over 40 years, over 4 decades. And here we have a project that we're going to have 111 units without inclusionary zoning that's been done with property that we own as a city, and look at what we're doing without that type of zoning. We're incentivizing, we're developing affordable units without mandating the developers that they do it. So thank you very much.
Anyone else? Okay. And I'm assuming Mr. Lofgren doesn't have anything he'd like to share with us today. Okay. All right. With that, thank you for coming before us today.
Thank you, Chris.
Nick, it looks like we have potential action today.
Oh, if so, that was a mistake on my part. Potential action next week.
I'm sorry,
January
the
16th.
16th. That's my mistake.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you. And you'll all stay here with us for item 2, the resolution for the Housing Trust Fund loan request to the First Step House for 426 South and 500 East. Nick,
And the applicant is also here for that, in case you're
Great.
curious.
Nick, anything you want to start us off with?
No, I'll just let hand staff take care of it.
Similar to before, I'll just give a brief summary of the request and what was approved by the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. First Step House submitted an application for acquisition financing through the Housing Trust Fund for a property that is right next door to where they currently have a treatment facility, and are also have a pipeline development, which is a 9% tax credit project, 75 units of permanent supportive housing, which also was awarded 9% credits this round, so it'll be moving forward. This property is envisioned as new construction with 40 permanent supportive housing units. They are in the early stages, and the Housing Trust Fund loan will serve as acquisition financing for them to be able to proceed with this property and moving forward in the development process. Their goal is to apply for 9% tax credits in October of 2018, and should they be awarded, they would move pretty much on schedule for a 2019 construction start for that property. The terms of this loan are different than the last one we discussed, which is serving as permanent gap financing. This is a short-term loan for acquisition. The idea being that with a 9% program, it would generate sufficient equity to be able to pay back the loan once they closed on their construction financing. One thing I'd just like to note is that in their original application, they asked for the full acquisition cost. Due to fund availability and also in terms of Housing Trust Fund, but also the Home Development Fund, which was approved, I think, last year or the year before.
As part of the federal funding log process, the council approved the board's recommendation to have a fund that was available for projects that were leading up to construction. And so this is an example of how that fund is being used. So it's home dollars that are being exercised in this capacity.
Yeah, so they were able to apply for home funds to fill that gap, and those funds actually, serve a critical need and had terms that worked well for them. So that was what the request ultimately ended up being, was the part that could not be covered by home funds through the Housing Trust Fund.
Council members? Councilmember Wharton, then.
Yeah, this is the brick building, right, with two peaks. Isn't it a historic building?
So the applicant has been working through this process, and there are not historic restrictions on the site. I think that they can correct me with details if I'm wrong, but I believe that there was significant renovation that was done to the property a while back, which actually took away the historic features of significance.
Oh, okay.
Anything else? James? What if the October application for 9% is unsuccessful?
Council Chair, that's a great question, and that is the risk of this transaction. What I would say is that First Step House is actually a very fiscally healthy agency, and so if need be, they could repay the loan. I think that we hope, and it is our anticipation as a community, to continue to encourage Utah Housing Corporation to do another round of permanent supportive housing to meet the needs of our community. And so that is the path we are going forward on, but there is a risk for that, absolutely. And not just for the Housing Trust Fund, but also the home dollars, because we would also have to end up returning those dollars as well if this did not go through. So this is also sort of the balance between a deal that comes in like the previous one where all of the financing is in place versus an early deal where you don't quite have all the pieces to the puzzle and in fact presents a greater risk. But we felt comfortable taking it. I want to make that clear as well.
And that is partially the reason for the 4-year term of the loan, because it gives them the opportunity to go back for another cycle should they not be awarded in the first round.
And the terms for repayment are included in the loan
How do you mean?
if they are unsuccessful in obtaining any of the tax credits?
Yes, they would still be obligated to repay the loan. Of course, I assume they could always appeal, but legally and as we draft the legal documents, the expectation will be regardless of the award that repayment would be expected
Okay,
in full at that time.
great. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you very much. We will be also looking for a council action next week on this one. So item 3 is a resolution for the public benefit analysis for financing 315 East and 2nd South, the very same development we just talked about in item 1. And it's the 3 of you that get to stay here with us for one more item. Who wants to start?
Let you guys go.
I'm
Is
happy to
anybody else coming up with this?
Randy, I think, would probably want to join us.
Come on up, Randy. Grab a mic. Tell the people who you are.
Off guard. Thought it was the third item on the agenda.
This is the third. We are on the
Were we
third
on the
item.
Third,
Yes,
yeah,
we're
very
there.
quick. We're moving right along.
Been so quiet.
We're ahead of schedule.
Perhaps I could start, Council Chair, council members, just by giving a little background on this transaction. I think that the Violin Commons, as it's going to be known, is a really great example of extreme collaboration and negotiation to get a deal with also a lot of affordability done. The teams worked very hard, and I would say very affectionately that we had some productive but intense meetings around the expectation of what should be built and purchase price and all of the above. And I feel like what we have come out with here is a really great solution to a difficult transactions. What we know about affordable housing is it's not easy, and no two deals are the same, and so that makes it difficult to continue to hold each standard. So as we thought about bringing this public benefits analysis and working with finance and legal, what we feel like is that this is the best approach and will maximize both what the developer can do and also the benefit to the city. So with that, I'll let either Randy or Lily kind of lead off on the purpose. I think one thing to make really clear about the public benefits analysis, and thank you to the council staff for doing a great job on the staff report, is that it's not a decrease in sales price, it's the actual terms of the loan. And so when we were evaluating whether or not a PBA was required, we all felt like it merited a review because it is still unusual, as most of our affordable housing transactions are.
I'll go ahead and defer to Ben, or Nick, excuse me, or Lily.
So I think I will just provide an overview of why the public benefits analysis, and Melissa gave a good synopsis of it in that the sale of the property is at the appraised value. A portion of that would come in at closing, but a portion of that appraised value would come in over time through payments to the city structured through a seller note. And what particularly the public benefit analysis is considering is terms of that seller note which are deemed to be below market. And those terms that are deemed below market is what the analysis is in regards to. One of those is the interest rate for the first 5 years of the loan at 0%. And then the other is the payment structure, whereby some of the payment comes through surplus cash. And what we wanted, the rationale for those terms really is what Melissa was getting at, which is these below market terms help to expedite and ensure the delivery of those affordable units. So the city will be repaid over time as opposed to all up front for a portion of the appraised value purchase price.
Council members, any questions? You're awfully quiet today. It's just that good. Yeah. Oh,
This is a great way to start the year.
please
I'll ask an
do.
obvious question then, Madam Chair, if it's okay.
Please.
Talk about what's the risk to the city in this particular below market proposal.
Well, I would say that the loan as it stands is going to make the city whole in terms of appraised value. I think as we really worked with the developers, one of our main concerns and our main risks is it going to get done timely? And is it going to come online in a way that is going to help meet the city goals of affordability? They have a permanent supportive housing project, a mixed income, Liberty Uptown, which we just talked about, and then a full market rate. And I think as we looked at the risk, I mean, there's always a risk of no payment whatsoever, but I would rank that as a very low risk. In this scenario, it was more about how do we ensure absolutely that we get those units online in a timely manner for a period of affordability that is meaningful to the city. And so that's the way we structured it. And if Forum and Cowboy were up here, they would tell you they're taking considerable risk in the market as well by delaying some of the building of Metropolitan and, of course, the influence of the market in general on housing.
So talk a little bit about that time frame, then shifting what gets built first and why, and their risk.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple pieces here. As a city, we wanted to ensure that the public benefit components of this project, which include the affordable housing as one of the biggest pieces, that we ensure delivery of that in a timely manner. And so that the way that the purchase and sale agreement has been structured is that the Magnolia, which is the 65-unit permanent supportive housing, has to move forward as the initial phase. And that results in some complexity. As we heard previously, the first time they applied for 9% credits, they did not receive them, so they had to go back. And they really needed to have that financing lined up to be able to move forward. So I think that's a challenge. I think that exists in all projects where you have this level of complexity and different elements that kind of have to coincide, particularly when there's shared infrastructure, like the parking, for example. So they were going to be linked regardless, and I think that the challenging piece is just getting all of that to line up and move forward at the same time. By enabling portion of the purchase price to come in over time, it has allowed the developer to move forward more quickly in terms of the schedule that they're able to commit to.
And I think they're looking at breaking ground on the Magnolia in
2018, later in 2018.
Go ahead, please, Councilmember Wharton.
And so then the Metropolitan would be next?
The second phase could either be the Metropolitan or Liberty Uptown. I think that it's likely that they could move forward on a similar time frame because they have the shared parking structure.
Okay, so, and when would that wouldn't start until Magnolia was completed?
No, it would start construction. They would be in construction at the same time, but Magnolia, per the purchase agreement, needs to be the initial phase. So it could be all the phases are under construction at the same time. We just wanted to ensure that the permanent supportive housing was going to be built.
Great.
Councilmember Johnston,
my question
please.
might be next before the developer themselves, so maybe I'll wait a little bit if we're gonna have them come up, or.
Sure, let's invite him back up. We have an extra mic unless someone wants to step down.
Thanks again.
Welcome back, Chris.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So one of my questions is, you're doing a historic rehab of what will be the Metropolitan at this point, either second phase or third phase. Is that accurate?
Yes, likely the third phase.
Like the third? Okay, is that a standalone sort of financing deal for that building itself, or is that tied to the other two?
The financing will be separate.
Separate.
Each building will be independently financed.
Okay, because my question is that, okay, worst case scenario, the stock market tanks and a lot of things go downhill in the next few years prior to being able to get in the middle of that particular project. So if that's standalone, that wouldn't be contingent on these other projects, or in the financing isn't intermingled that way, or?
No.
Okay. Because I can see sort of getting, this is a massive project, I can see 3 different buildings and different financing structures, and not being able to get all the way through all of them and leaving the pipeline building sort of as is. And what does that look like for you all, I guess?
So any project involves risk and timing risk. I mean, that's part of our job. As Lily noted, we are looking to the Magnolia to get that done as soon as possible. The Magnolia is a standalone building. The Magnolia actually doesn't need parking. The other permanent supportive housing projects in town have very little demand from the tenants for parking. And so the Magnolia is fully funded. and ready to move forward, and we are going to move forward with haste in getting that started. Liberty Uptown is likely to be the second because it has a shared parking garage and it has the longest construction time frame. So we're going to want that garage to be online to serve both Liberty Uptown, the Metropolitan, all of the surrounding commercial. So we'll be focusing on getting those two in the ground together as soon as possible and designing the site and building the site. So certainly, as we've mentioned, the complexities of this particular project are many, and financing is certainly chief among them, which is why we've had so much discussion and so much work with HAND and with the city and finding, the right mix of tools. So I think part of the conversation has been, how do we try and mitigate that timing risk as much as possible by getting to a point where the financing is secured, the project is put together and understood so that we can move through design and construction as quickly as possible.
Okay. My only other question is about Magnolia itself. So at some point, does Shelter the Homeless take ownership of the land and building itself, or how
Yes.
does that happen with them?
So they were actually the owner, the applicant. We were the developer and the development consultant for their 9% application. So we will be doing all of the pre-development and construction and getting the building to delivery, but the eventual owner of that building will be Shelter the Homeless, and the operator will be the Road Home.
Okay. And is there going to be an agreement about the plaza and ownership and working of that between all
Correct.
three, or
Yes,
both
the-
entities, I guess?
The three buildings will have an agreement for the maintenance and operation of the open space.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. If there's nothing else, while we have you here, and we've been talking about 2 items with the Housing Trust Fund. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
You may sit down if you'd like to. Could I ask you for a little status update on the Housing Trust Fund? We have some very simple graphs in our packet items, but I'm wondering about whether there's some projects in the pipeline that you could
Yes, I would love to give a
let
status
us know
update.
about.
I think what would be kind of great.
Been able to leverage our funds. We put out $13.5 million in Housing Trust Fund loans, which was leveraged against $300 million of other financing. So that's about a 1-to-22 ratio. And that created about 1,400 affordable housing units, some of which are still underway, but that's the total number. So that's about an average loan per restricted unit of a little under 10,000. And I think what we've seen in recent years is that there's a rising demand for our funds, and that's coming with escalating market and also other funds for affordable housing either staying level or declining. And I think those are trends we'll continue to see. The majority of our loans, as Melissa said, have been long-term gap financing for multifamily rental. And these projects have many, many layers of financing, and we are often the last missing piece to the puzzle to get things moving. A couple other statistics that we thought were interesting, over 2/3 of the developments that have received Housing Trust Fund loans in this period were mixed income. And the remainder that were not mixed income were primarily permanent supportive or housing that served very special needs and vulnerable populations where mixed income is harder to achieve. So that's just a high-level overview of kind of what we've seen in recent years.
What's interesting is that with the funds dwindling, and we really actually appreciate the recent influx in Housing Trust Fund dollars, because we actually wouldn't be able to loan any more money if it wasn't for that, and so we look forward to being able to leverage that in the near future. What is interesting is in anticipation of dollars being minimized, or minimizing dollars, is the Housing Trust Fund opted to do a one-time review of the pipeline to make sure they could issue some sort of interest to developers earlier on, so that we weren't waiting until the 9% and 4% were allocated. So as opposed to them saying, okay, now we have 9%, and if you don't give us this 500,000, then we won't be able to do the deal. The idea was for them to come to the board earlier on and say, this is what we're thinking, is this feasible? And so the Housing Trust Fund Board was able to then prioritize deals where they felt the financing was needed the most. So it was sort of an informal vetting process that has never been done before. And what was interesting about this year is that none of the 9% tax credits actually ended up needing to come in for a formal application because the equity that they received from the tax credits was sufficient. And so we are learning more and more about where the gap is in the market, and 9% tend to have quite a bit of cash in them, whereas other options like a HUD 221D4, which is a federal funding type of loan, and then also 4% tax credits, need a much higher rate of financing, and they have much larger gaps. And so as we learn that, we're trying to adapt and go forward as well. In the pipeline, we have one coming up from the Housing Authority and VOA, Volunteers of America, that is a much smaller acquisition rehab, and you'll see that in the coming months. And the Housing Trust Fund Board just approved that.
I appreciate the kind of 10,000-foot overview of what has happened. I wonder if the rate of loans has increased. You mentioned how many units in the last year, or in 2016? But are we loaning more often, and are we loaning more to more permanent supportive projects than historically we were?
You mean like the actual definable permanent supportive housing?
Yes, I mean, what else would we have called it? Just SROs?
No,
previously?
that would have been it. I just wanted to make sure I was on the same page with you, Council Chair. In the past, I think we've only, I would say in general, it has to be a couple of things. We are doing more loans. I will tell you that 2 years ago when I started here, the most loans we had done in any annual cycle, I think, was 3. And that was a big year. And then over the last 2 years, I think we've done 8. And with these additional 3 that have just been approved, the one in December and then these 2, that will be 3 this year. So there's definitely an increase in demand. We haven't seen a lot of permanent supportive housing because there hasn't been any tax credit support for it until recently. And so it will be interesting to see as those projects come forward if they will actually need the Housing Trust Fund. It isn't looking like it. I think the gap for permanent supportive housing projects is not in the build, but in the operations and maintenance, which is entirely different, but I know of importance to this body as they think about how households are supported once they obtain housing.
Different fund, though. So I guess, council members, it just brings up the question also with the administration of how do we maintain the fund adequately for the demand that the market has, with the understanding that you all have gained in with the reality of federal influence on the local market. But are we funding it enough? And if not, then how do we increase the funding stream here? And that is rhetorical today. Unless Councilmember Kitchen wants to weigh in.
Council Chair, could I just add one more point of context? The reason we were able to loan as much as we have is because we didn't loan for so long. And so there was a long period in which money was adding up and then was able to be deployed. So I just want to make sure that that's known, that that's the reason we were able to do the loans that we have been able to do in the past. We don't get that much.
Great.
Annually.
Thank you. So we have this up for a public hearing. We're going to set the date tonight. We'll hold public comment on the 6th, and we can take action on this one on the 20th of February. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Next is number 4 on our agenda. Is the resolution Arts for All pilot program, and we will have Sylvia Richards from the council office staff, Leah Summers, and Sarah Pierce, or it's Sarah tonight? Okay, great. Come on up. Hi, ladies.
Hello. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I'm excited to have you here.
We're excited to be here.
Would you like me to do
Sylvia?
just a
Sure, while they're
brief
setting up.
introduction?
Thank you.
This is an opportunity for council members to receive some additional information or have questions addressed about the Arts for All pilot program. And as you know, this is an opportunity to make Broadway show tickets available to those who might not otherwise be able to enjoy arts programs. That would include city and county residents. And there is a surcharge included in all of the Eccles 50-cent surcharge included in all of the Eccles tickets that will be sold to pay for the tickets. And Leah from the mayor's office has a 5-minute introductory statement that she'd like to make.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time to hear about this today. This timing is actually pretty critical to us starting in the time that we had originally planned, so we really appreciate it. Thank you for that recap, Sylvia. I'll just go over the overall details of the program really quickly, and then welcome any questions if that works for you all. So as Sylvia mentioned, the Arts for All program is a program of the Eccles Theater that allows for income-qualified residents of Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County to attend performances at the Eccles Theater. The goal is to distribute 1% of all available seats for every performance to ticketed events, which equals about 25 tickets per performance, which adds up pretty quickly, as you can imagine. The Arts for All tickets are free to income-qualified residents. Other programs around the country sometimes charge a small $5 or $10. For this program, we are proposing that it be free of charge to city and county residents that receive SNAP benefits, which is food stamps, or for those who qualify for free or reduced school lunch. The program, as Sylvia mentioned, is funded by a fee that is tacked on to every ticket sold for performances at the Eccles Theater. It's a 50-cent fee, which allows this program to pay for itself, which is wonderful. And all of the funds that are spent through that 50-cent fee go to purchasing tickets and distributing them to residents of Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County. We're hoping to have this begin February 2018 with the first show of Sound of Music. And right now, the tickets have already been purchased for the very first Broadway season through July of 2018, and we will add shows as we can. And then, of course, this is a pilot, so we're also collecting feedback during this time that we can incorporate into small changes into this model. The tickets will be distributed through the ownership structure of the theater, so 75% of the tickets that are given away will be to Salt Lake City residents and 25 to the greater county area. In order for, and this goes into distribution, in order for it to be completely fair and impartial, we're working with a third service provider, Lucky Seat, that can use a drawing mechanism for residents who register online, over the phone, or in person.
So it's not a lottery?
Well, we can't say lottery. It's a random selection. But yes, potato, potato. A rose by any other name. The registration and notification will start 10 days prior to each show, and recipients can pick up their tickets at the theater box office on day of show. So it's not lost in the mail, it's not lost at home, it's there waiting for them at will call. We talked a little bit about the eligibility structure. We also limit tickets to 4 tickets per person per year, so that gives an opportunity for a lot of people to receive tickets to shows. If we need to adjust that number to allow for more people to participate, if there's a really high demand, or if we're not seeing as much engagement, then we can mess with that number a little bit, but that's where we're starting. I talked about the distribution, the 75-25 split. Another piece of the eligibility is just how the ticket pickup works. I talked a little bit about that. It'll be at the ticket box office. If you can show a picture ID and a SNAP benefit card or your free or reduced lunch letter, that's how you pick up your ticket. We'll make those requirements very clear and make it as easy as possible for anybody collecting tickets. The communication plan has been really masterfully handled by the mayor's communication staff and also the Center for the Arts communication staff. Our goal is to get the word out about this program far and wide, and we have a number of different avenues that we're working toward to make that happen. Like working through Title I schools, human service agencies, and other nonprofits, working through our community councils, using local press, TV stations, newspapers, and then developing ongoing partners that can continue to push, this program opportunity out. And then as you can see, a number of communication tactics that I just went through a little bit. So that's, in a nutshell, the components of the Arts for All program. Are there any questions or thoughts? We will also have a feedback loop that Center for the Arts is developing so that every person who receives a ticket will make a point to touch base with them, and they have an opportunity to talk to us about their experience from registration all the way through attending a performance, so we can make sure that it's as seamless an experience and enjoyable one as possible.
Hi, thanks for being here today. Two questions off the top of my head. The first is on the budget, and I see Danny in the audience. Can you, I see that there's a one-time RDA contribution. I don't recall where that fits into the budget, and it looks like it hasn't been dispersed yet. Do we have any insight on that?
Yeah, Danny, if you want to come up. The budget piece will come in a separate resolution to the RDA board since it's RDA funding. This resolution is specifically asking for the city council to approve the program. It's listed in the ECHL's ownership and operation agreements that the city council body needs to approve the program before it can begin. As it stands, the tickets have already been purchased, and that funding was intended to be a cushion of sorts. So if there are lower ticket sales and the fee goes down, you're still able to purchase the same number of tickets, kind of a safety net.
Okay, so I guess my question is, are we looking for this in a budget amendment or fiscal year 2019 budget cycle?
The funds are actually already allocated within the RDA's Block 70 funds, specific account number. They are sitting there waiting to be used. And so likely to the extent that this has to be a budget amendment, that would come back to you probably on the RDA side. But realistically, the funds have been allocated with this purpose in mind. So I think this would just, you'd probably want to approve it as an amendment just because it's a slight deviation from what was originally intended, but it's all still within the scope of the original funding set aside.
They were set aside in 2013, 2014. So it's a while ago.
Gotcha.
They've been waiting.
So
fabulous. Okay, thanks, Danny. I
No problem.
appreciate that. And my second question is, I'm reading here in the council staff report. It says, after the Broadway season ends, July 2018, the CFA will evaluate the program's effectiveness and make adjustments as necessary. Can you speak to how you will be evaluating this program?
And I'll ask Sarah to jump in on that.
The software that we're using to distribute the tickets will give us a lot of data analysis. So we'll be able to look at, how many registrations are we getting? Is the disbursement working? What kind of feedback are we getting from the surveys and the feedback loop that we put together? And also just to make sure that it's not clunky. We want it to be really easy and accessible and explainable to people so that the tickets are getting in the right hands. So I think it's really more of us just saying, give us a couple of shows to get the wheels turning and make sure it's running smoothly, and we may come back with some, obviously, of course, we'll come back with a report and let you know how it's going. We've purchased tickets through July, but I can see us starting to purchase more between now and July for the rest of the year because we want to do way more than just the Broadway. Eventually, it's going to be every show. We just wanted to start out with a little slow so we can make sure it's working.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for being here, and I'm super excited about the program. I really do appreciate it. The only thing I'd like to look at in your evaluation is about the ID requirements, and if that's a problem for some populations of kids who will come in or their parents, if that's going to be a hindrance to them actually coming in to get the tickets or obtaining them. So that'd be interesting to hear back about if you have data on that, or if you talk to the schools or anybody else and they say this might be a barrier, a problem for some of our students. Other ideas about how you might overcome that.
So just to be clear, are you talking about the eligibility of the SNAP and the letter, or are you talking about the physically
Collecting the ticket.
Yeah, it could be both because a lot of folks are undocumented in my area, and they may love the program but are hesitant to sort of go that route because of the ID requirements, and it's particularly perilous right now. There's a lot of angst. It has been going on for a couple of years now, but looking at other ways to verify identity and eligibility without make it prohibitive and scary to sort of come in.
Yeah, and those are, I mean, I definitely want to make sure that this is a comfortable situation, but we're also dealing with scalpers on the other side of it. So it's a balance, and, please be forthcoming with any feedback you get, because I'm super sensitive to that and want to make sure that they get in the right hands.
Schools would be a great place to talk through that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
B.
All sorts of different ways. We want to reach the people directly, so we want to go through schools, libraries, the county and the city, human services departments that already work with these groups. We think that's a great way to be more direct to the people, but we'll also have, the traditional print and online advertising as well to get the word out. Any suggestions you guys have, we'll go through both mayor's offices and the councils as well.
Will you be sending flyers or something out through the schools then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And we're happy to provide all of the information that we send out to you for I know many of you have newsletters, and if you'd love to help us in that, we'd certainly welcome it.
And there'll be information to post on all the websites, to the city and county websites.
It would be, I hope I can speak for all of us, that we would love to share that information and whatever photo, logo, images, and some brief write-up that we can share.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
If you can get that to our office, we will be all over that. And my last question that I thought of after, I appreciate the small group meetings that you offered to brief us on this. After that, I thought that with the 10 a.m. pickup of the tickets, and I hope the strict policy around validating the SNAP or the free or reduced lunch eligibility, that if people show up and say, this really is me, but I don't have my letter or my card, it would be a shame to have the tickets not be used, and yet I really want I hope that there will be a strict policy around validating the eligibility. And so I'm wondering if there's a plan B, if there's an extra 5 people that Lucky Seat will draw, that the ticket office could contact that day to say, I know it's in an hour or two, whatever, but we have a ticket available. And if you have a strategy around that.
Yeah, and we're not actually requiring people to show up early that morning for a show that night, because we don't want it to that be another barrier. So they can just come,
It could be as early as 10 a.m.
Yeah, as early as 10 a.m. They can also come right before the show.
Right.
So that's something we'll have to look at and see if we're getting consistent where we're not getting the people with the proper ID.
Where people
These are
know
the things we
showing.
want to work out as we launch
Right.
it.
I encourage you to think about a wait list and alerting them when you alert the people who are receiving tickets that if they want to come down before the show
With
starts.
our proper documentation, and we can
Yeah,
go from
and
there.
then
That's a good
because
idea.
I think for anytime you throw any party, no matter how fabulous it is, not everyone shows up that says they will, and we want these tickets to be used. So if you can alert an extra 5 or 10 people that if they want to come down, they may get a ticket, I think
That's
we'll
a
have a
great
higher
idea.
rate of
That is
utilization.
a great idea.
Okay, council members, anything else? This is so awesome. 50 cents goes a long way.
Oh,
Yes, Councilmember Fowler, please.
Madam Chair, I was just going to make a motion, unless there's anything else.
I think this guy was trying to make a motion, but
You can second my motion.
Ooh. We will have one across the hall, actually.
All right, you do the one now, I'll do one.
Is there one right now also?
Just across the hall.
Oh, so
We'll
you get to arm wrestle before the formal meeting. So we're not going to make a motion right now, but we're going to do this in the formal meeting. And tickets are ready for Sound of Music next month, right?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much, ladies. That takes us to item 5. Oh my gosh, we're on time. Look at that, it's 5 o'clock almost. Legislative issues of 2018. Lynn Pace, come on up. And I would like to ask our mayor to come up, if you don't mind, so we can talk through these priorities and hopefully come up with a city priority list that we're all on the same page on for our legislative breakfast on Friday morning. Thanks. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So, Lynn, welcome, David. The list that we have is so vague. We need some context here.
Yes.
And if you could just run it through the filter of why did you put it on this list for each item?
Thank you for having us, and thank you for taking the time this evening. There are lots of things that we can and probably should discuss relative to legislative items. And when I say legislative, I mean state legislative, because I know you guys are the legislative body here.
Right.
But and so this list was developed primarily because we need to have, among the hundreds of bills that we will be tracking and monitoring, there's lots of stuff, but it's really an attempt to focus our efforts both internally for our lobbyists and for our legislators to say, there's lots of stuff we'll be dealing with, but these are the top priorities. Bearing in mind that we don't control all of what will happen during the session, there will be surprises and things continue to change. But that's how we have come up with this list, because these are the things that we have heard that are pending, or because they are priorities for the city, notwithstanding what individual legislators may be pursuing. So if I can I'll just work through this, and we can go into as much detail as you'd like. And I should point out, particularly for our new council members, that the city, it is very important for the city to, as much as we can, present a unified front on legislative issues. By that, I don't mean that anybody should bite their tongue internally or withhold their opinion. I expect and we welcome a robust discussion internally, but it is not productive for us to have that public dialogue or debate up on the Hill. So whatever debate we want to have internally, that's fine, but we certainly want to get to an agreed upon list of priorities and an agenda that we can share as a unified message to legislators up on the Hill. So,
Madam Chair, one point on the list itself, and Lynn will talk about this, I bet, but when it says no legislation like in Northwest Quadrant, doesn't mean there's not going to be. It means they don't have a definitive bill right now they know of, but they may likely have something come up. So don't be confused by that language on that list.
correct. Thank you.
Monitoring.
Yeah. So, and we can work through these, but really our reason for being here tonight is to make sure that we discuss this list, anything that you're uncomfortable with on the list, or anything that you think is a priority that is not on the list. Because this is obviously the starting point for our discussion on Friday with our legislative team. So The first one is affordable housing, and that's obviously a high priority for both the administration and the council. But in terms of, and there's a number of things we're pursuing, but in terms of items where we would need state legislative authorization or assistance, we really only have two things that we're looking at. One is expanding the scope of the authorization for design build projects. Right now there's a $250,000 threshold, and if we can eliminate that threshold, or at least eliminate that for cities of the first class, we think that would give us broader flexibility for affordable projects. And it doesn't change the game plan, but it makes projects, it makes them more affordable and reduces the cost of designing and developing those projects. We already have a sponsor for that. Senator Maine is working on that, so we're hopeful to get some dialogue there. There's also a bill, this was not our request, but there's a bill that is being sponsored by Representative Wild, and he's interested in taking the current statutory requirement that requires every municipality to prepare and file a moderate income housing plan with the state every 2 years. But that's all the statute says. You have to have one, and you have to update it every 2 years. He's looking to beef up that statute, either with some tools or enforcement or consequence, so that it doesn't just become a wish list that you file every 2 years and then forget about. So we don't know exactly where that may go, but he's contacted the League of Cities and Towns, and he's contacted us to say, how can we move the ball forward to get more out of that study than what we're getting today?
What is the league saying on that?
The league is open to the discussion, and we certainly want to know what we can do. Now, bear in mind, no city wants the state mandating land use, right? But we think that there's an opportunity to go beyond the simple preparation of a study without anything more, in terms of, particularly for communities that may not have as much expertise on this issue as Salt Lake City, so that we get more from that existing statute than we do today. So those are the two. There's a number of other things I mentioned that we're working with on affordable housing. There was a lot of discussion about using tax increment. I've been informed that's a tool that's already available. We don't need legislation, but it is a tool we'd like to use. You had a discussion last week on inclusionary zoning. We don't need any state authorization there. There is a bill that we did not ask for, but there's a bill being pursued by Representative Edwards on the possibility of property tax abatement or something along those lines. We would, of course, welcome any discussion that helps highlight the need and helps move the needle in the direction of more affordable housing.
It may be worthwhile for this, I'm sorry to jump in, but just a quick question on housing for us. And we've talked about it a little bit in the legislative subcommittee meeting, but we keep talking about the need for a dedicated revenue stream for the Housing Trust Fund. In fact, we just had that conversation. And it seems like maybe there's an opportunity for us to begin a dialogue with certain legislators, whether it goes anywhere this session or not. But I would really like to put our leg out and test the waters on whether that's an impact fee or something else. But what are your thoughts, David and Lynn and the mayor, on this?
So, Council Chair, if I may
Please
address
do.
that. Thank you. So one of the issues that we are testing the waters on is, what are we calling it? Not an impact fee.
No,
We're getting creative.
In lieu fee or?
No.
No, but on affordable housing, it's a, it's not an impact fee, but
It's
housing
an
assessment fee?
No, it's like an impact fee, but it's actually a model that's used quite commonly across the country, and it is an item that we've discussed with the legislative subcommittee. And we think there's a lot of value in that as an ongoing dedicated funding source. And we are initiating that conversation. We have had some conversations with Representative Edwards about looking at that and possibly studying that over this next interim. It is something that we know, just the nature of impact fees, that there's an opposition stakeholder group on anything relative to impact fees. So we think initiating that conversation, being able to look at the models across the country and show that it's not something to be scared of that's new and unused. And so we are trying to initiate some of those conversations, very much along the same lines that Councilmember Kitchen, you were thinking.
I can say that in the meetings I've been sitting in regarding transportation or housing, there is a lack of desire for some new funding to be on the table. And as I have discussions with mayors across the Wasatch Front, whether they're from Utah County or in our area or north of us, there is a desire to push the legislature for some new tools, but we're not getting much back, I can tell you that.
One other thing you should be aware of is that unrelated to the dialogue on affordable housing, there is a separate dialogue that is being pursued by development interests who have, based upon a Gardner Institute study, determined that part of the challenge to housing affordability along the Wasatch Front is government regulation and government fees. So, and this dialogue sort of cuts at cross purposes because while, of course, we want to inspect buildings to make sure they're safe and they comply with zoning and all that sort of thing, and the bulk of the cost of housing is, of course, the land value and the construction costs, but they can't control either of those. So they're focusing on the third leg of the stool, which is government regulations, fees, impact fees. And so there's a real push to say part of what will make housing more affordable is to reduce government fees and processing. Well, if we at the same time have a discussion about raising impact fees for affordable housing, those tend to be competing discussions. So you just need to be aware. I think there is discussion about that, and we think that's worth exploring. I don't think that's a realistic expectation for this session, however. That answers your question.
Are you hearing anything on short-term rentals this session?
I have not heard anything. That's not to say it won't happen, but I've not heard anything about it. Okay, so affordable housing is a priority. And I should say these are not in any particular order. So it's not like they're listed one ahead of the other for any reason. The second one is homelessness issues. Obviously, that is a high priority for the city as we move toward the creation and activation of these homeless resource centers. There may be other legislation, but one major item that we're aware of is a bill that will be sponsored by Representative Elison that is designed to assess more broadly the costs of operating these homeless resource centers across the entire region, across the state. And this dovetails with the speaker's argument and his position that homelessness is in fact a statewide issue, notwithstanding the fact that a few communities are hosts of those facilities. This bill is intended to assess the costs, or at least a portion of those costs, statewide. The question has arisen, however, as to how it is assessed, how much is assessed, how the money is collected, where it goes. The latest proposal that we have heard is a proposal that would assess the costs by county, but the county would assess those costs to individual municipalities based upon the amount of affordable housing that already exists. Because there's a belief, and justifiably, that the amount of affordable housing that is created has an impact on the demand on homeless resource centers. So if a community has a lot of affordable housing, their assessment would be lower than a community that has no affordable housing. But all of those factors get pushed up or down depending on how much money you're trying to collect and how it's assessed. And there will be lots and lots of dialogue. There's already lots of dialogue among the various communities because some, of course, would prefer one method of collection, some would prefer another. Some would prefer a straight head tax, some would prefer a property tax assessed to the county. The counties, of course, would prefer to have those costs assessed to the cities. So there'll be lots of dialogue, but given that Salt Lake City is going to be hosting, we are host to these facilities, that is a bill that is a high priority for us.
Councilmember Kitchen?
Is there a shared definition for affordable housing among legislators?
There is a definition in the statute, and I don't know whether it's a state or a federal statute, talking about 80% of adjusted medium income, 50%, and 30%. So there's differing thresholds.
And so they would count all.
Correct.
Every unit, whether it's 80% AMI or 12% AMI.
And well, what the model that they have talked about is one that would assess how much housing exists in your community at each of those levels,
Right.
and the cost would be assessed accordingly.
And they would set a kind of a baseline. So this is where you should be at, and if you're below it, then they assess that fee
Right.
based on that 30, 50, 80.
There would also be a credit for any community that hosts a resource center.
Right.
Again, there's question as to what counts and what doesn't. Does the Lantern House in Ogden count? Does the facility in St. George count?
Do we get
That's the subject of the
prorated in this for our years and years?
I think
of
given where Salt Lake City is in terms of the facilities we host and the amount of affordable housing, there would be no negative fiscal impact to Salt Lake City. We would be recipients.
Councilmember Johnston and then Councilmember Wharton.
The question on this one, have you seen any specifics about how it's allocated yet, though? You just talk about it?
I have seen a sample spreadsheet
Okay.
for Salt Lake County that said, suppose you were trying to collect, and they
Right.
just threw out a number, $10 million, and suppose these factors, somebody produced a spreadsheet.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that up is because council members may not know, but the men's one that's scheduled for South Salt Lake, it's a little behind for the other ones already, but part of the issue there is the infrastructure buildup on that road it's on is not there, and there's some expectation that monies maybe from this source would be used to build that, or at least reimburse for it, to actually build that facility. That could impact us because if it's not online in June 2019 or whatever time frame that is, it means we still have 300 men who are supposed to be there and not have a place to be. And so I'm very interested in this bill because of the funding mechanism that would allow that to happen. So,
Yeah, it's 200, and it's mixed population.
South
Oh,
Salt
the
Lake.
South Salt Lake
and
one.
not ours.
Okay.
The South Salt Lake 10th West doesn't
Yeah.
have the infrastructure
All
built
right.
in yet.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So they're struggling with that piece, and they don't have South Salt Lake doesn't have the funds that we have, essentially, to do some of the stuff they need to do. So they're waiting for that.
Yeah, I will just say there's lots of variables at play in this. It is intended to help the communities that are hosting these facilities to help to defray the costs that they are incurring, and you're all too well acquainted with that. But there's lots of people pulling this in different directions for their own advantage. There are those who say, well, if those funds are collected, some portion of that ought to go to the homeless providers, not just the municipalities. Well, that would dilute the fund. If the state expects to be reimbursed for any of their costs, that would dilute the fund. So as I say, there's lots of variables, lots of discussion, but this is a high priority bill. And at least thus far, the speaker has said that this is a must-pass bill. So we have his support, but what it will actually look like in the end is
So my question is not necessarily a Salt Lake City question, but does impact us that if that funding is meant for a variety of things, kind of open-ended, it could be infrastructure up front, it could be long-term police presence, all those kind of things. But watching the specifics of that bill would be important for us to know looking forward about what we're looking at in 19 for us. So
yes,
absolutely.
Councilmember Wharton?
What about ongoing funding for Rio Grande, and are they still going to be providing like additional security or backup officers from other jurisdictions? And aren't there ongoing costs too with Rio Grande for this coming year, or was that covered when they did
yes,
the package?
and David may know more about this.
Okay.
My understanding is that has occurred, that other jurisdictions have been providing support.
Yeah.
I don't know how long that is expected to continue. One of the factors I would expect those jurisdictions to include in this bill is that they would want credit for their contribution as an offset to whatever they might otherwise have to pay. Those types of things. But David, maybe you can.
So, Councilmember Wharton, I will follow up. My perception, my understanding, and I'll confirm or come back with better information, that the special session addressed the funding needs associated with Operation Rio Grande. There may be some built into to the new budget, and the funding is primarily, as far as law enforcement, the state funding is primarily the Department of Public Safety and Utah Highway Patrol. Most jurisdictions are no longer involved in terms of law enforcement entities and support. But I will double check as to whether there will be funding associated with the fiscal year 19 budget associated with Operation Rio Grande. But most of that, my understanding, was addressed during the special session.
Okay. Second question is about the downtown liquor store on 4th. Do you think that I've heard a lot of chatter about them closing that this session? Do you think that that's likely?
The conversations I've had is there is a lot of pushback from the business community against closure.
Okay.
So I think there's a bit of a political battle, but there's also some funding issues with that, contracts that are in place, lease agreements for the space, and so that also is a financial burden for the state to do an early closure.
Right, and it worries me that people who travel to Salt Lake from out of town, and where would they, there'd only be the wine store, which closes at 7.
Right.
And then, are there any air quality bills that the city is interested in or would have an interest in coming up on this session?
Well, the short answer to that is yes, of course. We are always interested and we are always supportive. I am not aware of specific air quality bills being proposed for this session. Okay. Maybe Mary, maybe you know more than I do, but
I think Patrice Arent, Representative Arent, is working on a bill, but it's very quiet and unfortunately quiet on Capitol Hill on this issue. I think as a team, we are going to have to work harder to set the example for the state.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to that point, while we're on there, is that may be something where even though we're not aware of any legislation, if that's a priority for us, it might not hurt just to say air quality and just to keep that on the table and keep it as a discussion item to remind everyone that is a concern and it is a priority for us and would be looking for anyone who's willing to partner with us to advance that dialogue.
I was
Madam
going
Chair,
to suggest that one.
I was going to suggest it as well, but I know that your list is just a draft.
Yep.
And a couple of things that aren't on there, solar, I don't know what's going on with that, as well as billboards. You know that always something comes up at the last minute. So, and it always has an impact in Salt Lake City. So I think those are the other two besides clean air for me.
Billboards and what? Sorry, James?
And solar.
Thank you. So we could have, I think instead of water issues, we could have an environmental issues and maybe some breakout sections and include alternative energy or solar, however you want to phrase it, air quality. And we got a bucket of water issues.
Yeah, there's several.
Yep.
Should we jump in there since apparently there's nothing on Northwest Quadrant or the
Yeah,
airport?
well, let me just touch on those briefly, and that is...
We'll go whistling past the graveyard here.
On the Northwest Quadrant, our goal, our priority is to have no legislation. I am confident there will be bills proposed. But as you well know from what you've already dealt with today and continue to deal with, Salt Lake City has been very aggressive in partnering with the state and with the private landowners and other interested parties to move forward economic opportunities in the Northwest Quadrant. And to be quite blunt, we don't need any legislation from the state to continue that process. Our priority, of course, is preserving the city's land use authority in the Northwest Quadrant and our taxing authority and appropriation authority over property tax and other tax revenues. So just let me quickly touch on the airport. We've been just slightly schizophrenic there. Our priority is no legislation because we're in the middle of a massive rebuild project. The airport is a model of efficiency and low cost nationwide. And we are very much of the opinion that it is the envy of the nation and it doesn't, there's nothing broken that needs to be fixed. So our goal is no legislation with a small footnote, and that is that with the rebuild of the airport terminal, we do need a revision in the structure, the current statutory structure for allocating liquor licenses at the airport. And so we will be working with the appropriate legislators and lobbyists to, and the reason we have to do that now, even though we're years away from occupying it, is because during this next calendar year, the airport will be issuing RFPs for the providers, and they will need to know, before they bid on those RFPs, how many liquor licenses they have. So it has to be done now. So, now, down to water. Is that where you wanted to go next?
Let's get in the boat. I'll just keep the puns running. Thanks.
The first two bills listed there are bills that have actually been filed. We oppose both of those bills. One of them deals primarily with the issue of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Under state law today, Salt Lake City, cities of the first class, have extraterritorial jurisdiction, and for that matter, every city has some extraterritorial jurisdiction. Cities of the first class have it to a greater degree. That bill would eliminate extraterritorial jurisdiction for cities and for water service districts in a way that is completely unworkable. The biggest, a lot of this is aimed at Salt Lake City because we are the oldest city, we have the oldest water rights, and so there's a lot of attention to what Salt Lake City does. And when we make decisions, particularly decisions in the watershed, sometimes there are people who are unhappy with that. But the real challenge here is that Salt Lake City, under the Clean Water Act, has the obligation to provide clean drinking water to its citizens, and not just Salt Lake City citizens, but a lot of the East Bench of Salt Lake County. If this bill were to pass, it would effectively prohibit Salt Lake City from protecting that water source while still leaving us with the obligation to provide the clean drinking water. It is untenable to think that we would be left with the obligation without the ability to make sure the water is clean. So we're having I was just in a long meeting today about this, we're having a dialogue about this. I think while there may be merit in discussing this and making adjustments to the scope of that statute, it is certainly not appropriate. That bill cannot pass as drafted without further adjustments and further dialogue. And that would be, I think, an extreme public safety risk to our citizens and those who rely on our water.
Councilmember Wharton and then Councilmember Luke, and I want you to get more specific about what adjustments you think might be appropriate, because I've been in meetings with you and I've been under attack many times in other capacity for this, and it didn't seem that there were any ideas that we had around appropriate adjustments to this statute.
Okay. Do you want me to speak to that now, or do you want me to take questions first?
Go ahead.
Okay. The issue that has come up, and bear in mind, I am not the water expert, okay, but I've gotten educated on a lot of this as I've dealt with these issues. Salt Lake, cities of the first class have extraterritorial jurisdiction from ridgeline to ridgeline.
And right now, cities of the first class include Sandy most recently.
Sandy,
Ogden.
Salt Lake City, not Ogden, Provo, West Valley, West Jordan.
Thank you.
But as cities grow, once they hit that 100,000 threshold, there'll be more. So one of the complaints is, do we have competing jurisdictions, Sandy and Salt Lake with competing regulations? That's a red herring. All of us have the same interest. We coordinate very well. That's not been a problem. The second issue that has been raised is that because that jurisdiction is ridgeline to ridgeline, there are people who say, well, Salt Lake City gets some of their water from Deer Creek Reservoir or even from Strawberry Reservoir. Does this mean that the Salt Lake City Council has jurisdiction over what I do on my farm in Juab County or in Wasatch County, right? Again, I am not the water expert, so I don't want to be proposing any remedies here, but I have heard from our public utilities folks that we have never exercised, nor do we intend to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction to protect the water, to the water quality outside of Salt Lake County. This is really a tool that we have used in the Wasatch Canyons to protect those vital water resources in the midst of, as you know, exploding public use of those lands, to protect the water quality. So we think the risk that the Salt Lake City Council is somehow going to prohibit a farmer from grazing on his lands in Wasatch or Daggett County or something, we think is really far-fetched. But that's a fear that a concern that they have. So I guess my point would be that I think we might be able to clarify the statute in a way that says that preserves the tools we need most, while allaying some of the fears in those other areas, if that makes sense.
Is it right on those heels?
Yeah, it is. It's on water. What about with the?
Wait a second. Third in line. Councilmember Wharton, then Luke, then Rogers.
Wouldn't some of these require a change to the Utah Constitution, because it delegate a considerable amount of authority to cities on
Actually,
water?
you're actually moving to the second bill, which is surplus water contracts.
Yeah.
And if I can, let me jump to that issue.
Okay.
Under the Utah Constitution, cities are prohibited from selling water. Okay? And I'm assuming that was designed to keep some misguided city council from selling the inheritance, right? So there's a constitutional prohibition on selling water, but lots and lots of cities, including Salt Lake City, have extended water service outside their boundaries. But since they can't sell the water, state law does allow them to use surplus water to offer to those residences and businesses. Most of the east bench of Salt Lake County, our service area, is serviced on surplus water contracts. By contract and by law, it is by definition only surplus water, meaning it's available as long as we have enough. And they are terminable on 30 days notice. Well, we have obviously built, the county, have obviously built millions or billions of dollars of infrastructure on these surplus water contracts. The issue that has been raised, and this bill by Representative Coleman is a little bit muddled, but the core concern is, how do we, when we have what are intended to be permanent improvements, how does that fit with what is only in theory a temporary or surplus water contract? That's a real issue. I don't think anyone in Salt Lake City intends to ever cut off service to those communities or those users, but under the terms of their contract, they are, they're terminable on 30 days. People would like to find a solution to that. One solution is to amend the Constitution. Another solution might be just to amend the contract. But no one knows yet. They've identified the problem. No one knows what the solution is. And my experience is on any major water bill, it doesn't happen quickly. It takes at least a year of study to get it right, to get all of the appropriate interests at the table. These two bills, even though they raise what are legitimate issues, need a year of study.
Oh, sorry, I don't have my mic on. The first two have huge implications. Does it seem that there's an appetite to move quickly on these two, or like more than usual? Well,
I will tell you, no sponsor ever tells you that they're content to have their bill postponed. But I think if you were to survey a broader range of interested parties, they would all concur that neither of these bills are we're not likely to be able to get it right within the short time frame that we have, which suggests that while they may be raised this year to highlight the issue, they might then go into interim study for further discussion. But I think the sponsors, of course, would say, yes, I'd like my bill to pass this year.
Yeah. Further on that point, so neither of these two bills are priority bills.
I think they're both priority bills.
Yeah.
They are.
Oh, yeah.
I know Representative Noel's bill is.
Okay. On both the extraterritorial and the surplus water contracts, have we talked to, or where are we with some of the discussions from our customer base outside of Salt Lake City? So I know with Mayor Silvestrini, his appointment is coming forward for the Public Utilities Board. But have we talked to, and where are these other municipalities? Are they supporting us on this? Are they?
I will tell you, and I can't, I can't speak universally, but this is not an issue for water users, I will say, in the valley. All of these issues are being raised by disgruntled water users or property owners in the Wasatch Canyons who would like Salt Lake City to allow more development.
This is not being driven by municipal
Okay, but have we talked to our other municipal partners, and are they going to be pushing back on this bill, or is it just going to be Salt Lake City pushing back?
No, we will have partners for sure, and in fact, we have some meetings coming up to discuss these bills.
Have we had those meetings? Do you know I mean, have we
Well,
had
the new
these
mayor in
discussions?
Sandy is
Yeah.
just getting his legs under him, but that meeting is getting scheduled to meet with them. And as you know, Tom Ward is over there and understands these issues very well. They're in alignment with us, and so is the mayor of Mill Creek. And those have
Heights.
been the initial discussions so far, so meetings will
Okay.
be coming.
We have a new mayor in Cottonwood Heights as well,
Yes.
so.
Yes.
Right.
I will say historically, Sandy, who has been in a very similar position to Salt Lake City, we have been in absolute uniformity.
Yeah.
The other municipalities have been less involved, but generally speaking, they have been supportive.
Because I
and we
think
will
that,
certainly-
I think getting them involved, especially on these two bills,
Oh, yeah.
since it is dealing specifically with their issues, even though they're not the ones pushing it, I get that it's coming from outside the Wasatch Front. But I think we're going to have much more success if we get
Absolutely.
them pushing back on this as well. In addition to municipalities, I know that there's a new director at the Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy. Are they up to speed on both of these bills? Because I know that a lot of the surplus contracts go directly through Metro Water.
Yes, I'm not the one to speak to that, but I know that Public Utilities has frequent dialogue there, and so they might
Okay.
be able to answer that question. I have not had any contact
Okay.
with them, but
And again, Metro Water is not going to be a huge help with Representative Coleman, but the Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District would be. And it seemed because they're the ones that contract with West Jordan and the west side for a lot of the water issues there. So I hope that Public Utilities or the mayor's office is also reaching out to both of those water company or water organizations as well. On the reducing the current water requirements, there's no bill there.
I'm not aware of a
Who's
bill.
pushing that one?
Well,
Do you know?
it's being pursued by the development community, home builders primarily. And this doesn't affect Salt Lake City as much directly because Salt Lake City, because we were an early city, we have water rights already. But in most high-growth communities, you can only build if you bring water enough for your development. And so their concern is, given the most recent, the audits that the state has done on water, they think that 400 gallons is higher than is actually needed. And so if you're building in Eagle Mountain or Saratoga Springs and you want to build 100 homes, if you lower that threshold from 400 down to 200, it costs you a lot less to build those homes.
Mhm.
So it's being driven by the cost of providing water for new homes in high-growth communities. But that same threshold, wherever that gets set, today it's 400 gallons a day. If that gets reduced dramatically, then lots of areas that today are unbuildable in the watershed tomorrow become buildable.
Mhm.
So it has an impact on us, even though we're not the ones creating the problem.
Okay.
It's been an issue that I know the development community has talked about. Whether or not they will get a sponsor and run a bill, I don't know. But that's why it's on the list.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So I think this is a pretty direct follow-up that we could, as Councilmember Luke's requesting, could we get a update in some form, even a written briefing or some other way of the coordinated response that we
Yes.
are?
And don't get me wrong, I don't mean to punt on that. It's just Public Utilities has lots of dialogue
Sure.
with their counterparts.
No,
I'm
and
just not aware of
I
all.
didn't take it as you punting on it
Okay.
or getting away from it. But I do think, Madam Chair, that would be very helpful. And again, with our lobbying team, that's great, and we have a very good lobbying team, and but a lot of these other municipalities do as well. And I think the sooner we can get them on board, the sooner that we can hopefully engage their contract lobbyists as well on this issue.
Yep. And in the Quality Growth Commission meetings over the last year or more, they have actually been quite present at the public hearings where they've needed to be. So they are obviously in coordination with Public Utilities.
Yeah. So even though there is a change in leadership in many city governments, the staff is consistently working with our team. So depending on which city you're talking about, even though leadership has changed, the teams are working together.
Madam Chair, my question is kind of a follow-up to Charlie's, and that's in regards to the league. Where's the league at with these bills? And you know, kind of reaching out the same way. I think that if they're not on board, we have a lot of cities that are close to becoming cities of the first class that we need to start hitting up and asking them to start putting pressure on the league if they're not on board. I mean, can you imagine if the league and all the cities were up at the legislature pushing them on this? We wouldn't even be discussing this.
Yeah, these bills just came out, so I suspect, I haven't had those conversations, but I suspect that we will have the support of the league.
So we have
on all
not
of
spoken
these
to the
issues.
league about this yet.
Oh, I have, but we haven't
Well, where are
had-
they at then? They haven't got
They're
together.
supportive. I'm just saying the league typically on an issue like this, they'll get together a
Right.
meeting of
Right.
10 cities with all the water experts. That meeting has not occurred, but the league is
Yeah,
supportive
initial
on this.
dialogue with Cameron has been very positive, and I would say that there's a strong desire under his leadership to look out for the bigger cities a little more than maybe in the past. You know, there's a heavy driver that's been happening with rural communities about how the league engages, but it's been made very clear that the cities along the Wasatch Front need better support from the league, and he's listening to that.
We will have the league's support.
Thanks.
So, the last one I wanted to mention on this is the third one listed there, the canal relocation bill. That bill number is from last year. Senator Hinkins, we expect he will file a bill this year, but we've not seen it yet. That bill will be up and likely will pass this year. That's a significant issue for Salt Lake City because we have water in those canals. We own some canals. We also, so sometimes we're the owner, sometimes we're the water user, but or sometimes we're dealing with the developer who wants to relocate the canal. This bill is intended to clarify the rules for the various parties when development happens that either necessitates piping the canal or relocating it or adjusting status quo. And we tend to have interests on all sides of those issues. So we're very interested in that bill, but we're working on the substance of that, and we'll keep you posted. Anything else on water?
Anything else on environment?
Anything to note on Central Wasatch Commission?
Speak to that, Mayor.
Yeah, so there's a new bill that we just got a copy of. I think it's HB 160. It's Mike Noel. He has a piece of legislation that I've asked our city attorney to review that prohibits local government from advocating for any sort of designations, federal designations of land. And so we're looking at that to see if it has an impact on the Central Wasatch Committee and the work that we are doing there. And so it's an interesting session already.
Does it have legs?
Well, at my first look at the bill seemed like it had a lot of constitutional issues. So we'll see. We'll see.
Will you keep us updated?
Yes,
at least
absolutely.
the subcommittee
And
as
can we
closely
add
as
that
yeah.
to the list here?
I think, and Mayor, maybe you can speak to this, but I think aside from that bill, my understanding is that as to the Central Wasatch Commission, we don't need any state legislation. We may need federal legislation, but that's a different
We don't
project.
need state.
But that's why it was initially not on our list, because we didn't need any state action on that issue.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of concern bills that,
Yes.
Well, as usual, we're playing a
As
lot
usual.
more defense than offense.
but we don't
that's-
want to list those.
that's- I'm happy to list them if you want. What I don't want to do is
Draw
this would be
attention.
This would be my concern, for instance, on a billboard issue. If we say billboards are a concern, we create an issue that at least today may not exist. That's different than saying we're concerned about air quality because we want to raise attention. We want to create dialogue. On billboards, we may not want to. So I don't know if we really want to put that on the list unless we want to draw attention to the issue.
Lynn,
What's that? Yes.
I'm talking about our own personal list.
Okay. I understand.
These are
Okay.
public meetings.
I will assure you, council member, if there's a billboard bill, we will be all
We're
over it.
extremely transparent in this council, so.
So
We're going to put
I
a
would
kick me
be-
sticker on our back.
I guess I would welcome your feedback as to whether or not you want that bill from Representative Noel to be included on this list.
Well, I think we need an absolute update back to the council on the findings of the city attorney.
Okay. Then we can talk further about that.
Okay, Councilmember Rogers, you good? Move on. Okay, we've been into this 45 minutes, and I can keep on going, but
Well,
the
so
meat
could I,
of our
but-
list is ahead of us. So.
Tell me how much more time you got. 5 minutes?
No, 15.
Okay, 15. All right. Transportation issues. There has been all interim long a transportation task force dealing with governance, funding, and land use.
Lynn,
Yes,
can
ma'am.
I pause you and ask you to skip to the tax issues?
Tax issues.
First,
You know, I
and
was
then
just
we'll
going
go
to
to
do that. Thank you
transportation.
for the invitation. The tax issues, there has also been not a tax reform task force, but the Revenue and Taxation Committee has been meeting overtime to discuss a whole list of tax reform issues. When we met as a subcommittee, I came in with what I thought might be the ones that were most interesting to you. At the invitation of staff, they said, you know what, why don't you give us the whole list and let us determine what you're interested in. So on this part of the list, you do not have the administration's priorities. You have the list of everything that we're aware of that is out there. So I need you really to look through that list and say which of these you really care about.
And can
All
you
of
highlight the
this-
priorities then?
And to tell us which ones are priorities.
I wanna
All
know
of this
your
is going to
priorities too, though.
change, of course, because no one knows the full impact of the federal tax changes yet.
Right.
And so everything is a little bit in flux. But just so I can walk you through this, they're talking about making changes to the newspaper ad for truth in taxation. What those exactly would be and what they'd look like, we're not sure.
And who?
The state would be making changes.
But you don't know of any
Well,
particular
there has
legislators
been
yet.
talk about the fact that that all property tax entities are more heavily reliant on other sources because the state has made it difficult to raise property taxes. So they've said, well, what if we changed the ad so you didn't have to say you were raising taxes, or what if you didn't have to use a newspaper ad, what if we just put it on the website? They're thinking about that. But the goal would be to make property tax, an adjustment in property taxes easier to do. That's the goal on that first one.
This seems like something we'd be opposed to.
It's up to you. We don't.
Yeah, until you see the language of a bill, it's very hard to know, right? So we're hearing the talk and we're keeping track of who's having these conversations, but until we can see the bills, it's hard to even know where we're landing.
The second one is an expansion of the manufacturing, sales, and use tax exemption. I would recommend we oppose that because that would cost us a whole lot of money to expand that sales tax exemption.
Even before this one is written.
Well, we know what the goal is, and that is that anything that's manufactured and resold, they want to be exempt. We understand that because there's an element of double taxation in that, but the fiscal impact for Salt Lake City would be significant. So, sales tax of streamed media and amusement devices, I think that's a fairly small item, at least in terms of fiscal impact, but they're talking about that. Registration fees and road usage charge programs for electric vehicles and electrical vehicle tax credits. That dovetails a little bit into the transportation dialogue, where the legislature seems to be anxious to make sure that all users of the highway pay a share of the costs, and they're trying to figure out what that ought to be.
Yeah, and I've pushed back a bit on the dollars that they are coming up with and made recommendations on what would be more reasonable if they head down that road. But preferably, this is not the time to push back on electric vehicles. And so for me as a leader, I would prefer there were no fees at this point. On electric vehicles, we need to get more in our market, and but we're pushing for at least a much more reasonable fee. They started at $200, and something a little more fair and reasonable is like $50. So we'll see what happens.
So this is a revenue opportunity for highways.
It spills over both into transportation and into revenue and taxation.
And into environment, but they're not talking about that.
Right, yeah.
That wasn't the primary interest.
Right.
Let me go on through this list. Property taxation of business personal property. And I don't know if that is the same or not as this bill, House Bill 21, which is certified tax rate amendments. What that would do is put in a 5-year averaging on the amount of new growth that you realize from increases in personal property. We think that would have Jennifer's giving the thumbs down. We've talked about this bill. It makes it harder to predict, and our finance people have said that will have a negative fiscal impact for Salt Lake. We would oppose that bill, but unless you're really sort of a tax wonk, most people won't understand what that bill does. And then we've got a couple of bills here. The exact impact varies. Local option sales and use tax distribution formula amendments and sales and use tax exemption amendments. One of those is essentially extending the hold harmless for very small communities. There are 3 or 4 around the state that will never grow out of their hold harmless. City of Alta and a couple of counties, and it's essentially extending or removing the sunset of that hold harmless. That's an outgrowth of the restructuring of the sales tax redistribution back in the mid-'80s. And then there may be a bill talking about sales tax on internet purchases. That's obviously been a priority for the city for a long time, but I suspect there'll be legislation, but it's always failed in the past because it's politically difficult. Yes.
It is. It is.
Council members, any comments, questions on the tax ones? On the edited priority list that came to the legislative subcommittee, which of these potential bills are real?
The ones that I had highlighted were, 1, the Truth in Taxation newspaper ad. The reason I did that is because the League will be supporting that, because many, many cities out there, not Salt Lake City, have been reluctant to adjust their property tax rate because of the poison pill of posting an ad that says you're raising taxes, which has left them chasing sales tax dollars and retail and all those other things. So the League is supportive of something that will make it easier to adjust property taxes for inflation. So now, we don't have to get involved in that, but that's one that I know the League will be working on.
It's really just adjusting the transparency around property tax increases.
Well, there's an argument that and we had this discussion in the subcommittee, there's an argument that if your rate is 0.15 this year and next year it's going to 0.14, and you want to take it to 0.14 or 142, that there's an argument about whether or not that really is an increase in taxes. But under state law, you're required to post an ad that says, we are proposing to increase the property tax rates. In many communities, that's a death sentence, and they're not going to do it because they don't want their next opponent to use that as ammunition against them to say, you said yourself you were raising taxes and you voted for it. So the League has for many, many years been anxious to soften the elements of the current law so that cities can use a broader funding base for their operation instead of relying solely on sales tax and fees.
You let us know if something comes up here.
Yes. The other one that I think we've always supported in the past is anything that would help us to get a global sales tax on internet purchases. So we have typically been supportive of that, but we are not going to drive the dialogue on any of these issues. So.
Just those 2. Okay. Transportation issues. We've got 5 whole minutes.
Okay, transportation issues. This task force has been coming up with a number of recommendations. One of those will be the restructuring of the UTA board. They will do away with the current 16-member board. They'll reduce it to a 3-member full-time commission with right now they're proposing a 9-member advisory board. I'd be interested to know what you think about that. It is difficult for us to argue in favor of the status quo because I think everyone recognizes that the current model has some challenges. Having said that, Salt Lake City right now has a guaranteed seat on the board statutorily. Under this new model, there would be a 3-member commission with membership appointed, 1 from Salt Lake County, 1 from
Salt Lake City,
from Utah and Tooele County, and 1 from Davis and Weber County. The advisory board would have a guaranteed seat for Salt Lake City. But we would not have one of the 3 commissioners.
The commission, though, may not be structured that way either. So there's a lot of dialogue around how you determine who the commission members should be. But the advisory board today has a seat for Salt Lake City. That also could change. There was some dialogue around going to a 5-member board, and the county's really controlling those seats. So there's some differing opinions between county and city, and we'll see.
On the funding side, the dialogue has been about taking the current state transportation infrastructure fee, TIF, and opening that up so that some portion of that could be used for transit. While that is appealing in the abstract, one of the questions we've wrestled with is, where would those transit dollars likely be spent? And the challenge with the transportation, the TIF, State Transportation Fund, is that right now it is structured, it is weighted toward congestion and growth. And so allowing greater flexibility in the funds may be useful, but it doesn't increase the number of dollars available. And so it would still depend on the priorities or the prioritization of those funds as to where they get spent. And obviously Salt Lake City isn't one of the high-growth communities where we have, I mean, we do. We have our congestion challenges, but not like we have in Point of the Mountain or someplace like that. So that's what they're talking about on the funding side. On the land use side, and this is all, they all interrelate. On the land use side, what they've focused a lot of attention on is when the state invests millions of dollars to build a new highway corridor, they want to maximize the value of that investment, and that includes getting higher density uses along that corridor. But there's been lots of fighting and quarreling about what a corridor looks like, how wide that is, whether it's advisory, whether it's mandatory, is it by mutual agreement, or is it by mandate of the state? So there's lots of tug and pull on the land use elements of this transportation task force. I listed them not because we know what the bills are, but because we know there will be legislation in each of those areas. UTA piece, we have a pretty good idea where it is. A couple of other pieces that I've put on here. One of the funding sources they've talked about is a state authorization for a transportation utility fee. We don't know what that would look like. We don't know if they will pass it. There are many people on the Revenue and Tax Committee who hate that. They think a transportation utility fee is a hidden tax. But if we could get state authorization or sort of a safe harbor for a transportation utility fee, that would be very useful for us and for many communities who would like to be able to utilize a broader range of tools for transportation. And the last one I have on there is that we have Senator Harper has said that he will run a bill to provide an allocation formula or some guidance for the allocation of the funds that we've typically referred to as the quarter funds within Salt Lake County, which in the past have been sort of at legislative whim, and this would provide a formula for the distribution of those funds.
Thank you. So with the time, we have time, but I wanted to see if, Lynn, you could recap maybe what you've heard or how this list might look a little different on Friday morning based on this, and then
well,
Mayor,
subject to your feedback. Oh, sorry.
Then Mayor, if you could give us, if we could talk about maybe what you see Friday morning looking like, and if we'd like to go take time to allow the legislators who attend to talk with us, or how you might like to orient that time. And
yeah, based upon what I've heard tonight, what I would suggest is basically this list, but adding another category that is titled air quality and renewable energy. And not because we know of any legislation, but because that's a priority to us. And then I will need your feedback as to what you do or don't want to include on tax issues. We don't have to have anything there. We can put one or two. Obviously, we'd like sales tax on internet purchases. We would be opposed to any change in the sales tax redistribution formula. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, those have been, those aren't new. That's our long-standing position. But I don't know if you want to list anything beyond those two.
Councilmember Johnston.
One of the questions on the truth in taxation newspaper ad change is that we probably need to have an idea of how we want to take that. I don't know the specifics of the bill, but it sounded like it was about how do you notify. Either the wording in a newspaper ad or whether a newspaper ad is required anymore, period. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you wouldn't have to do it. Now, for us, it may not change much because we may choose every time to do a newspaper ad and ever so forth, but we probably need to have an idea of if we're going to take a stance on that, a unified stance. So that's one thing I would want to make sure we're clear about going into Friday.
Well, and relative to that, I think since we don't have a bill yet, it's easy just to say, we're concerned about that, we're interested.
We're watching.
We want to watch and see what the bill looks like, but when it comes out, our delegation, please know that we're interested in that bill, and that's one we care a lot about. And we can certainly handle it that way if you'd like.
So if people had a clear value about this one, then it'd be nice to know that. But
Do you?
I personally, having just served on jury service and seeing how few people actually haven't read the newspaper, I don't know it's the most effective way to do this. I think it also might be, I'm not sure it affects us a ton in Salt Lake City based on what we do so far, really. I think for other cities it might alleviate policymakers from avoiding sort of a good economic fiscal policy by having a broad base of revenue, including property tax, but that's not necessarily
well, and
for
remember
us.
that this will affect any property tax entity. So school districts, mosquito abatement, anybody who relies on property tax, because they all use the same noticing.
Yeah, so the funding for everybody is affected in some capacity if one or a few municipalities decide we don't even want to touch property tax, we're going to keep going to other revenue sources versus having a nice, hopefully balanced way to get revenue. So
Transparency can be uncomfortable.
I understand. Anyway, but unless you tell me otherwise, I guess what I would say is maybe take that tax list down to 3 items, which is we're interested in however that bill looks when it comes out, internet sales tax, and sales tax distribution. Maybe you leave it at those 3.
how long a list is reasonable?
You know what? Less is more. Because if we gave our legislators a list of 50 priorities, that's not helpful.
And are they going to look for something specific from us, as far as I want you to prioritize these in order of how you want us to do it?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think we will have to say water matters more than tax. Or, they won't be looking for that. But for most of them, they will look at this list and they'll take it and they'll put it someplace really safe. But they won't be able to find it when they need it, right? So it's really just a list of topics. To say to them, these are the things that we're really concerned about. Some of because we know there's a threat or a threatened bill. Others because it's a priority. And as long as we can keep that list on their radar screen, then when a bill pops up, they remember and they'll come grab us and say, here's the bill, what do you think? And that's very valuable to us. So that's the reason for the list and the meeting on Friday.
Sure. Do we need even bracelets with the different topics on them kind of thing? Would that be helpful?
No, but as a legislator, it's very helpful to know where the city really is on a bill, and that we are staying in constant contact with our friends in the legislature to make sure that they can articulate on the floor and in committee meetings, our concerns.
And I will just say, our delegation is so supportive.
Yeah.
I mean, they are so anxious to help us on whatever our priorities are. Often they say to me, tell me what your position is so I can go advocate. And if it's in flux, sometimes I say, I don't know yet because it's still in flux. But this is really to help them to help us, and they're very anxious to do so.
Yeah.
So Mayor, how would you like Friday morning to ideally commence, and how the dialogue could be oriented to get the most out of this early morning breakfast?
Yeah, I think it is a matter of us getting some updates on this and refining it a bit and getting back with you as the chair and discussing kind of how we want how many things we want on the list at this point. But we'll have some things to update before Friday. And then I think just if you and I can work out the details of that. But I see it as a conversation more than us telling, right? But more just what they've also heard. I think is very important that we get some input from them on what they're hearing, and then allow for some real dialogue to occur.
Great. Well, I'll be available and happy to collaborate. Thank you for this hour-long update. Thanks for joining us, Mayor.
Thank you for the time.
We'll see you Friday morning, if not before then. All right. That was the last item on our agenda before standing items. Do we have any announcements? Yes, please, Cindy.
First of all, just a reminder that your group council photograph is scheduled for 1:15 next Tuesday, and it'll be here at the building. I don't know. We'll let you know. Okay.
Will you add it to the calendar?
Yes, Robin, would you add that to the calendar? The photo and also whether it's indoors or outdoors? Thank you. Okay. And then the second item is we've been speaking with the chair and vice chair about the council retreat. We had reserved the date of Tuesday, January 30th for that. It looks like that date is still where we're headed. The place has been selected. It's the Leonardo. We haven't discussed with them the hours, and the council chair thought that would be a good thing for this group to talk through.
Yeah, do we want to hold it at normal work session time at 2 o'clock? Does that work best for everybody? Okay.
Okay, that was easy. And do you want to, are there any things that you want to tell them be thinking about ahead of time, or not?
I am hoping that we are going to be thinking about priorities that we want to fulfill the funding on, and whether that's the fund balance or fleet or police or streets or alleys. I think my hope is that we structure this in a way and actually follow up after the priorities meeting with some budget workshops with the administration, so that we're working months before the budget is presented to us to look at fulfillment of funding for some serious holes that we know have existed and that we've created ourselves very recently. So think about it that way, and I hopefully we'll have a little bit more direction by next week. Okay, so that's it for now. I'm sorry. I'm still learning, folks. No report from the chair, vice chair, unless, Chris, you have anything. And we don't have a closed session today, so we're going to adjourn until our formal meeting, which is a very brief formal meeting at 7 o'clock across the hall. Thank you.
tuning in to Capital City News, your connection to Salt Lake City government. I'm your host, Poonam Kumar. And to get things started off in the new year, we'll hear from Salt Lake City Fire Chief Carl Lieb about how the city scored its first ISO Class 1 designation in Utah. And our History Minute is about Salt Lake City's first Olympic committee. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back. At its last meeting of the year, the City Council passed Growing SLC, a 5-year housing plan. Bid farewell to Council members Stan Penfold of District 3 and Lisa Adams of District 7. Welcome new Council members Chris Wharton of District 3 and Amy Fowler of District 7. And returning Council members James Rogers of District 2 and Aaron Mendenhall of District 5. New and returning Council members will officially take an oath of office on January 2nd.
This is the grand opening of our Touch and Go convenience store at the Salt Lake City International Airport.
This is the first fueling station that's been at the airport in the history of this particular airport. You can come here, park in the lot, come inside. We have flight information displays around the building. You can keep an eye on the flight. You can get a great cup of coffee here at Beans and Brew. You can get some wonderful Mexican food or a hamburger or shop in the convenience store and be warm without your engine running.
There's no doubt that we will have real opportunity for people to turn their engines off. Even when it's super hot in the summer or very cold in the winter, you have a safe space here where you can get warm or you can cool down. It gets you out of your car. It helps you turn the key, turn your ignition off, and help us clear the air.
Even if you want to stay in your car, there's a flight information display outside, for summer months or whenever. But yes, people can park, come inside, stay warm, and really have a pleasant passenger experience. So we're really excited about this.
Today we took time out of our busy schedules to come and sit down with the kindergarten class of Meadowlark Elementary to sit down and read them a book about policing. That sounds interesting, doesn't it? Good job. You got some great books.
We had the opportunity to have the chief of police and some of the officers from the area here to come in and read to the kids. Kids were thrilled to meet the police officers and to have books that they get to take home. There was a lot of excitement in the room here today. We have emphasized the huge importance of being able to read and why it's important in our lives, even starting right now in kindergarten.
We hope to instill in them or to develop in them the love and passion of reading, because it'll pay forward for them in all aspects of their life.
Today we had 10 firefighters from Salt Lake City Fire return back to South Jordan here. They're soon to be on their way back up to Salt Lake City. They've been gone about 2 weeks now. They saw a fire both on the Lilac Fire in the San Diego area and then on the Thomas Fire in northwest of Los Angeles. And they're back safe, they're back sound. Their families are looking forward to seeing them again, of course. And we're just glad to have them back, and they'll be back in the groove of things here in Salt Lake City shortly.
This was a wonderful opportunity for our task force to come together, multiple cities, multiple jurisdictions throughout the state. We arrived in California to open arms, and the outreach from their communities to us was wonderful. It was really humbling to see the damage and the destruction that had occurred on that fire, and it was neat to be a part of trying to help make that a better situation for them.
You know, wildland season now is 12 months out of the year. That's just the way it is. It was very important for us to participate in this mutual aid request from California. It's great for the esprit de corps of the department and the morale. We like to contribute when our neighbors need help. For them, participating was an honor. And I'm just so proud to have more people than I could ever send, out of Salt Lake City to contribute to events that are going on in California.
It gave us an opportunity to see giant wildfire and use the tactics and training we've received here to help down there.
Yeah, our fire department trains 365 days a year, so we're prepared, we're well equipped, we're well staffed, and we're ready to help out anywhere in the western region, wherever we can.
The Salt Lake City Fire Department has met the gold standard for fire departments and is leading the way as the first and only ISO Class 1 designation in the state of Utah. Salt Lake City Fire Chief Carl Lieb is here to fill us in on what that means for the city.
Today, the Insurance Service Office is coming here to Salt Lake to provide us with an ISO Class 1 Public Protection Classification letter, saying that we are now a Class 1 fire department.
ISO is an independent advisory organization that measures risk. We evaluate communities on their fire suppression capabilities, talking to the fire department, the water department, and the communications center to evaluate how well a community is prepared for a fire risk.
They look at our staffing, they look at our apparatus, they look at where our stations are and our response times. They look at our investigation capability and inspection capability and our training records. All these things they analyze to determine whether the department is capable of modifying or mitigating the risk that we see here in Salt Lake City. And then some insurance companies will look at that and they say, well, they're a Class 1, their risk is reduced, and that manifests itself in lower insurance rates potentially. Big win for the city and the fire department. This is the gold standard for fire departments. So we're really proud to be a Class 1 city.
There are 270 Class 1 communities across the country out of 46,000 fire protection areas. So this is an incredible achievement that not even 1% of